in the northern heart of Europe, where the snow never seemed to melt and the mountains rose like silent giants, a poor farmer named Edward lived in a wooden cottage at the edge of a frozen valley. His days were filled with struggle, his nights with loneliness, and survival was his only companion. One evening, as the sun drowned behind icy peaks and the wind carried the cries of wolves, Edward returned home carrying firewood when suddenly a faint whimper reached his ears. It was soft, but desperate, the kind of cry that carried both pain and a plea for mercy. He followed the sound to the riverbank, where ice cracked under his boots, and there, half buried in snow, he found a small puppy, its golden fur wet and matted, its fragile body trembling with cold and hunger, its eyes wide with fear, yet shining with a strange spark. Edward bent down, lifted the creature into his rough, calloused hands, and pressed it against his chest, wrapping it in his wool cloak. The puppy whimpered again, then slowly nestled against the warmth, as if it had finally found safety. Edward whispered, almost to himself, "You are safe now, little one." He carried the animal back to his cottage, lit the fireplace, and laid the puppy on a blanket, feeding it drops of warm milk through a wooden spoon. Through that long night, as the winds howled outside, the puppy lay by the fire while Edward sat nearby, watching every breath as if guarding something precious. When morning came, the puppy opened its eyes fully for the first time and looked at Edward with the trust that no words could describe. In that silent gaze a bond was formed, stronger than iron and purer than snow. Edward named him Bruno. From that day the farmer and the dog became inseparable. Bruno followed Edward into the fields, guarded the goats, chased away crows, and barked at strangers as if he had sworn an oath of loyalty. The villagers laughed at Edward, saying he loved his dog more than his cattle, but Edward only smiled, replying, "The cattle give me food, but Bruno gives me courage." What Edward and the villagers did not know was that this small act of kindness on a frozen evening had created the beginning of a legend. For the bond between Edward and Bruno would be tested by wolves, by bandits, by fire, and even by war, and the little puppy, rescued from snow, would rise to become a protector whose name would echo through the valleys of Europe for generations to come. As winter deepened in the European valley, the bond between Edward and Bruno grew stronger with each passing day. The once frail puppy was now a sturdy young dog, his golden coat gleaming in the pale sun, his sharp eyes watching every movement around the farm. Bruno was no longer just a companion, he had become the silent guardian of Edward's cottage and fields. But the valley was not a safe place for long. Beyond the frozen ridges, wolves prowled, hungry and restless. The villagers often spoke in hushed tones about how packs of wolves had attacked farms, tearing livestock apart under the cloak of night. One moonless evening, when the snow was thick and the air sharp as glass, Edward sat by the fire, weary from his labor. Bruno lay by the door, ears twitching. Suddenly, he lifted his head and growled low, a sound like distant thunder. Edward listened, but heard nothing. Then came the chilling howls echoing from the forest, closer and closer. The goats in the barn bleated in terror. Edward rushed outside, clutching a lantern, only to see glowing eyes surrounding the farm. A pack of wolves had come, their fangs glistening in the lantern light. Edward's heart raced. He had nothing but an old wooden staff to defend himself. But before he could move, Bruno leapt forward, his bark splitting the silence like a battle cry. The wolves lunged, but Bruno met them head-on, teeth bared, muscles taut. He fought with a fury that seemed far beyond his size, slashing, snarling, biting one wolf after another. Edward tried to help, swinging his staff, but it was Bruno who held the line, his courage unmatched, his loyalty unshaken. The fight raged in snow, blood staining white ground, until at last the wolves retreated, tails between their legs. Beaten by the strength of a dog who refused to yield, Edward fell to his knees, calling out to Bruno, who limped back. Blood on his fur, but his eyes still fierce and proud. Edward embraced him, tears freezing on his cheeks, whispering, "You saved not just the animals, you saved me and this farm." That night, the villagers gathered, hearing the tale of the brave dog who faced the wolves alone, and they no longer laughed at Edward's devotion to Bruno, for they understood now that this bond was no ordinary friendship. It was the making of a legend. And as Bruno lay by the fire, his wounds tended, he lifted his head toward the snowy hills, his gaze unbroken, as if already waiting for the next challenge fate would send. The memory of the wolf attack lingered in the valley for many weeks, and Bruno's name spread from one farm to another, until he was spoken of as more than just a dog. He was called the guardian of Edward's land. But in the darkness of winter, new threats arose. This time not from beasts of the forest, but from men, desperate and cruel, for beyond the mountains roamed bands of thieves and mercenaries who preyed on poor villages, burning barns, stealing cattle, and leaving nothing but ashes behind. The villagers prayed each night for protection, yet fear grew heavier with every whisper of raids. One bitter evening, as snow fell in thick silence, Edward sat inside, with Bruno at his feet, the fire warm, yet his heart uneasy. Bruno's ears twitched, his body stiffened, and a low growl escaped his throat. Edward stood still, listening. Then came the sound of footsteps crunching through snow, slow, deliberate, and then the creak of the cottage door being tested. Shadows moved outside, lanterns flickered, and rough voices murmured. Edward grabbed his staff, but before he could open the door, it burst inward, and 3 bandits stormed in, their eyes greedy, their knives glinting in firelight. Bruno erupted from the ground like lightning, his bark thunderous as he hurled himself at the intruders, teeth sinking into the arm of the first man, who screamed in pain. Edward swung his staff, striking another, but Bruno was already on the second, leaping with a force that toppled him to the floor. Chaos filled the small cottage, shouts, growls, the crash of furniture. The third bandit slashed at Bruno with a knife, cutting across his side, yet Bruno did not retreat. Blood stained his golden fur, but his loyalty burned fiercer than pain. With unyielding courage, he lunged again, clamping onto the bandit's wrist until the weapon clattered to the ground. Edward fought beside him, his strikes fueled by desperation. Together, man and dog drove the bandit stumbling back out into the snow. One fled, limping, the others cursing in defeat. Bruno stood in the doorway, chest heaving, breath heavy, his body shaking, yet his eyes ablaze with fire. The villagers who heard the commotion arrived with torches, gasping at the sight of Edward's bloody but unbroken companion that night. They spoke no longer of Edward as the lonely farmer, but of Edward and Bruno as defenders of the valley. Bruno lay by the fire, his wound bandaged, while Edward whispered words of gratitude, promising that as long as they both lived, he would honor the loyalty of his faithful dog. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the tracks of bandits, as if the land itself wanted to erase their shadows. But the legend of Bruno, the loyal guardian, grew stronger for every trial only sharpened the tale, and fate had more storms to bring. Spring had come at last to the valley. The snow melted into rivers, and the fields glistened with green. Yet peace was never meant to last, for nature itself can be more merciless than wolves or thieves. One warm afternoon, Edward and Bruno were tending the goats near the edge of the forest when the air grew heavy with the sharp scent of smoke. At first, Edward thought perhaps a villager had lit a fire for cooking, but soon the sky darkened with a thick black cloud, and the crackle of burning wood echoed through the hills. The forest was ablaze. Flames leapt from tree to tree, carried by the dry wind. The villagers shouted in panic, rushing to save what they could. but the fire spread faster than feet could run. Edward realized with horror that some children had wandered near the forest earlier and had not returned without a thought. He sprinted toward the flames. Bruno raced beside him, his golden coat catching the red glow of fire. Edward shouted their names through the smoke, coughing as the heat scorched his lungs. He heard faint cries deeper within the blaze. 3 children trapped among the burning trees. Edward pushed forward, but the path was blocked by falling branches. Bruno surged ahead. Fearless, he darted into the fire, weaving through the smoke, his body low, his instincts guiding him. Edward screamed for him to come back, but Bruno ignored the danger his loyalty bound him to save. Lives. Moments stretched like hours until out of the fiery haze, Bruno emerged, dragging one child by the sleeve, while the other 2 clung to his back, their faces streaked with soot. Edward gathered them, pulling them away to safety, but Bruno staggered, his fur singed, his paws burned, yet his eyes never wavered. Together they stumbled back into the village, where mothers wept and clutched their children, thanking Edward and Bruno as heroes. Edward knelt by his companion, tears in his eyes, whispering, "You brave soul, you gave yourself for them." Bruno panted heavily, but pressed his head against Edward's hand as if to say, "I was born to protect you and all that you loved." That night, the fire still raged in the distance, but the village remained safe. Because of Bruno, the legend grew deeper, carried on the lips of grateful parents. The children would forever tell the tale of how a dog leapt into fire to save them, and as Bruno rested, his body aching yet unbroken, Edward watched the flames on the horizon and knew that greater trials still lay ahead, for a world so harsh never spared its bravest guardians. The fire in the forest left scars on the land. Blackened trees stood like silent ghosts, and the smell of ash lingered for weeks. Yet within the hearts of the villagers, a new light had been kindled. The tale of Bruno's courage spread from cottage to cottage until his name was spoken with reverence. People who once mocked Edward for giving his love to a dog now bowed their heads in respect whenever Bruno passed through. The village children followed him, laughing and calling his name. Women placed bowls of food outside their doors as offerings to the brave guardian, and the elders spoke of him as if he were a gift sent by heaven. Edward, though proud, remained humble. He would simply smile and say, "Bruno is only what loyalty makes of him." But even he knew that his companion was no ordinary creature. Bruno's fame traveled beyond the valley to neighboring villages, where farmers and shepherds told stories of the golden dog who fought wolves, chased off bandits, and saved children from fire. One day, a merchant passing through the region stopped at Edward's cottage. He had heard the stories and wanted to see the dog for himself. Bruno lay in the sun, his eyes watchful, his body relaxed. Yet the merchant whispered in awe, "This animal has the spirit of a soldier." Word reached even further until travelers from distant towns spoke of the valley where a dog had become legend. But Bruno cared nothing for fame. He remained by Edward's side, guarding the goats, guiding the cattle, and watching the horizon, as if always waiting for the next threat. His loyalty bound not by glory, but by love. The villagers, however, could not ignore that trouble always found its way back, for in times of hardship, men and beasts alike were tested. So when rumors spread of raiders gathering in the south, preparing to march through the valleys, fear returned to the people. At night, they whispered, "What if the bandits come again? What if armies follow the roads?" Edward listened silently, stroking Bruno's fur, knowing in his heart that destiny had not finished with them. Bruno sensed it too. His ears pricked whenever distant horns echoed in the mountains, and his body tensed as if ready for war. The villagers began to prepare, building stronger fences, hiding their supplies. Yet their greatest confidence lay not in walls or weapons, but in the golden dog who had never failed them. The night before the first raid, Edward sat by the fire, Bruno at his feet, and spoke quietly. You have already given this village more than anyone could ask, but I fear the days ahead will demand even greater courage. Bruno lifted his head, resting it on Edward's knee, his eyes burning with the same fire that had carried him through snow, wolves, and flames, as if to promise, whatever comes, I will stand. Edward felt a shiver run through him, of fear, but of knowing that his loyal friend was more than a guardian. He was the soul of their hope. And, in the silence of that night, the legend prepared to face its greatest trial. The rumors of raiders moving across the southern hills proved true, but with them came an even greater storm, for the valley did not only face thieves, it now stood in the path of armies. Europe in those days was restless. Kingdoms rose and fell under the clash of steel and ambition, and soldiers marched through villages, leaving behind fear and ruin. One gray morning, as mist clung to the valley, Edward heard the sound of drums, beating like distant thunder. Bruno growled, his golden coat bristling. Soon a column of armored men appeared along the road, banners snapping in the cold wind, their boots shaking the ground. The king's army had come. They were not raiders, but soldiers, hardened by war, seeking shelter, food, and recruits. The villagers gathered, nervously unsure whether the soldiers meant protection or plunder. The commander, a tall man with a scarred face, rode forward, demanding supplies and service, his voice sharp like iron. Edward stepped forward, with Bruno at his side. The villagers watched as the commander's eyes fixed on the dog, who stood proudly unflinching before armed men. The commander laughed and said, "So this is the famous beast. I have heard of the dog who fights like 10 wolves." Edward remained silent, but Bruno let out a deep growl that silenced the laughter. The commander's amusement turned to curiosity. He dismounted and tested the dog's courage by stepping close, but Bruno held his ground, his eyes burning like embers, refusing to bow. The soldiers murmured in awe. Never had they seen such defiance in an animal. The commander then said to Edward, "Your dog belongs on a battlefield, not in a barn. He will march with us." Edward clenched his fists, knowing he could never surrender Bruno, for to him the dog was not a beast of war but a brother. The villagers too cried out, refusing to let their guardian be taken. The standoff grew tense, until horns echoed again, this time from the southern hills, announcing that true raiders approached. The valley wolves in human form, armed with fire and steel. The commander turned, and in that moment, Bruno leapt forward, barking furiously as if warning both villagers and soldiers of the danger ahead. Edward shouted, "They are here! Defend the valley!" What happened next? Bound their fates together, for the king's men and the villagers stood side by side, while Bruno charged toward the first line of raiders, his body moving like a flash of gold among blades and shields. His bark rose above the clash like a trumpet of defiance, inspiring courage in hearts that wavered. Soldiers who had mocked him now fought with renewed spirit, calling out, "Fight!" Like the dog, and the valley erupted in battle. The clash between raiders and defenders shook the valley like thunder. On a stormy night, the sky filled with smoke, the ground churned under boots and hooves, and the cries of men echoed against the mountains. Edward stood shoulder to shoulder with villagers armed with axes and pitchforks, while the king's soldiers raised their shields and swords. Yet in the midst of the chaos, it was Bruno who led the charge, his golden coat flashing through the haze, his barks striking fear into the hearts of the raiders, who had never seen such fury in a dog. He lunged at their leader, a towering brute wielding a heavy axe, knocking him from his horse with a savage bite to the arm. The man howled in pain, dropping his weapon as soldiers rushed to seize him. The villagers cheered, their voices lifting the courage of those still fighting everywhere. Bruno moved. The tide turned. He darted under blades leapt onto raiders and drove them back, his loyalty to Edward, his love for the valley fueling a strength that seemed unbreakable, yet the battle was fierce. The raiders pressed hard, their numbers greater, their rage unmatched. Edward fought desperately, striking down one man after another, but his eyes never left Bruno, who bled from cuts yet refused to slow. The commander of the king's men watched with awe, shouting to his soldiers, "If this dog can stand, then so can you fight for your lives." The cry spread like fire through the ranks, and the defenders pushed forward. The raiders began to falter, their lines breaking under the relentless defense. Bruno forced them back, step by step, until the valley rang with the sound of retreat. Edward dropped to his knees, exhausted, clutching his staff, while Bruno limped to his side, his muzzle stained with blood, his chest heaving, but his eyes still burning with that indomitable flame. The villagers rushed forward, lifting their hero high, their cheers mingling with the songs of steel. The commander approached, saluting Edward, and then kneeling before Bruno, declaring, "This dog is no beast. He is a warrior, worthy of kings." From that day, Bruno was no longer just the guardian of a single farm or even a single village. He became the symbol of resistance across the land, a story to be carried by soldiers, merchants, and travelers alike. Yet as the valley celebrated, Edward felt a shadow in his heart, for he knew that with every victory, destiny bound them tighter to the path of war, and the bond that had begun in snow would soon be tested by fire, blood, and sacrifice, greater than any they had yet faced. The smoke of battle had scarcely cleared when word of the golden dog spread beyond the valley, carried by soldiers returning to their camps and travelers who had witnessed the fight. Tales grew with every telling. Some said Bruno had fought like 10 men, others swore he had driven off an entire horde alone. Whatever the version, all agreed that no mortal animal could show such loyalty, such courage. Soon the story reached the ears of the king himself, a weary ruler who had spent his life waging wars across Europe, and who valued bravery above all things. Intrigued, he sent a messenger to the valley, bearing a sealed letter of summons. The villagers gathered as Edward broke the wax, his hands trembling. The letter commanded him to present Bruno at the royal court, where the king wished to see the dog with his own eyes. Edward's heart sank. He had always feared the day others would try to claim his loyal friend. Yet he also knew refusal could bring punishment upon the valley. The villagers urged him to go, reminding him that Bruno belonged not just to Edward now, but to all of them as their protector. Edward agreed, though his spirit was heavy. The journey to the castle was long, through forests, fields, and rivers. Bruno walked proudly beside him, head high, as though he sensed the importance of their task. When at last they reached the royal city, its stone walls rose like giants, and trumpets sounded their arrival. Crowds gathered, staring in wonder at the golden dog. Whispers filled the streets that this was the creature who had defied wolves, bandits, and raiders. The king awaited them in a grand hall lined with banners, his gaze sharp and tired. As Edward knelt before him, Bruno stood firm, flinching under the gaze of royalty. The king descended from his throne and approached slowly, his hand outstretched. Bruno did not growl nor cower. He simply held the king's stare, his eyes steady and filled with a quiet strength. The king smiled for the first time in many weeks and declared before his court, "This dog has the heart of a knight. He shall stand as an emblem of loyalty for my kingdom." The nobles murmured, some scoffing at the idea, but none could deny the power of Bruno's presence. The king ordered that a medal be forged in his honor, and knights bowed to him as though to an equal. Edward, though proud, remained troubled, for he knew that with this honor came danger. The king spoke again, saying, "The wars are not yet ended, and I would have this dog ride with my men as they march across the land." Edward's breath caught, his arms tightening around Bruno. He could not imagine his friend torn from him, yet destiny gave no choice. The court erupted in cheers. Bruno had become more than a guardian. He was now bound to history, and the road ahead would lead not back to the quiet valley, but deeper into the heart of war. The king's command could not be refused, and so Edward, with Bruno at his side, joined the great march of soldiers that wound across Europe, banners streaming above armored ranks, drums pounding like thunder through valleys and plains. Bruno rode in a cart beside Edward, yet often leapt down to run with the men, his presence filling them with a strange strength. Whenever despair weighed on their hearts, the army crossed rivers and climbed mountains until, at last, they reached the borderlands, where an enemy kingdom had gathered its forces, and the field stretched wide like an open grave. Two great armies faced each other in silence, broken only by the snort of horses and the clink of steel. Edward felt fear claw at his chest, but Bruno stood tall, his golden coat gleaming beneath the gray sky. When the horns of war finally sounded, chaos erupted, shields crashed, swords rang, and cries of pain filled the air. Edward fought as best he could with his staff and borrowed blade, but his eyes followed Bruno, who darted across the battlefield like a flame of gold, leaping onto charging horses, dragging enemy soldiers from their saddles and barking so fiercely that even hardened warriors faltered. Knights who once mocked the idea of a dog in war now rallied to him, shouting, "Follow the dog," and striking with renewed fury. Bruno's courage spread like fire through their ranks, yet the battle was merciless, and the enemy pressed hard. Arrows darkened the sky. One pierced Edward's arm, forcing him to his knees, but before another could strike, Bruno lunged, biting down on the archer's wrist and dragging him to the ground. Edward gasped in pain, but rose again, driven by the sight of his companion, who never stopped fighting. Blood streamed down Bruno's side, yet his spirit blazed stronger than ever. The enemy commander, a fearsome knight clad in black armor, spurred his horse straight into the heart of the fray, his blade cutting down men like grass. Bruno leapt to meet him, barking with fury. He sank his teeth into the horse's reins, toppling beast and rider alike. The soldiers roared in disbelief as Edward and Bruno together struck down the Black Knight, their courage breaking the enemy line. Soon the rival army began to crumble, retreating in chaos. The battlefield lay covered in smoke and death, yet victory belonged to the king's men. The commander raised his sword high, declaring, "This triumph is owed not to steel alone, but to the loyal dog who carried us through." Edward knelt by Bruno, who lay panting, his wounds deep, yet his eyes still shone with unbroken fire. Edward whispered, "Hold on, my friend, we are not finished yet." For, though the battle was won, Edward sensed a shadow darker than war itself approaching, and he knew that the greatest test of loyalty was yet to come. The battlefield of the borderlands had scarcely been cleared when new danger arose, for the enemy, though broken, was not destroyed, and whispers spread that assassins had been sent to strike at the king himself. Vengeance for their defeat. The royal camp grew restless. Men patrolled through the night, yet shadows crept ever closer. Edward kept Bruno by his side, never letting him wander, for he feared that the storm of destiny was near. One cold midnight, as the king held council in his tent, the attack came, sudden and silent. Dark figures slipped past guards' blades, glinting in torchlight. They rushed toward the royal pavilion with death in their eyes. Bruno's ears snapped up before any cry was raised. He lunged, barking with thunder that split the night. The assassins faltered, startled by the golden beast, but pressed forward, knives raised. Bruno hurled himself at the first, his jaws crushing the man's arm before he could strike. Edward joined the fray, with his staff striking wildly. The camp erupted, soldiers rushing to defend their king, yet the assassins were many trained killers moving with deadly precision. Bruno fought like fire itself, tearing through them, his body already wounded from past battles, but his spirit unyielding. One blade slashed deep across his side, another pierced his flank, yet he did not stop. his eyes blazed, as he drove the last assassin to the ground, buying precious moments for soldiers to cut the attackers down at last. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of torches and the ragged breaths of men. The king himself emerged, staring at the bloodied dog, who stood swaying on his feet. Edward rushed to Bruno, catching him as his legs gave way. The king knelt beside them, placing his hand upon the loyal dog, and speaking words heavy with sorrow and reverence. This creature has given more to my throne than any knight. He is the truest guardian of us all. Edward held Bruno close, tears falling onto golden fur, whispering, "Stay with me, my friend." But Bruno's eyes, though dimming, still burned with the same light that had carried him through snow wolves, fire and war. He pressed his head weakly against Edward's chest one last time, as if to say, "My duty is done." Then his breath grew shallow, his body still. The camp fell into silence, broken only by the weeping of soldiers hardened by countless battles. The king ordered that Bruno be buried not as a beast, but as warrior, in the royal grounds, where knights rested, banners lowered in mourning across the kingdom. Edward walked behind his friend's body, his heart shattered, yet proud, for Bruno's loyalty had become more than legend. It was now eternal. The tale of the golden dog spread through Europe, sung by bards and carried by travelers, a story of courage, devotion, and sacrifice. Edward returned at last to the valley, alone, yet never alone, for every field, every river, every star above seemed to whisper Bruno's name, and in the hearts of those who heard the story, the legend of the loyal dog lived forever, reminding all that true loyalty never dies.